Hello, so I'm here today with Sheena Wilkinson, author, who's very kindly agreed to meet me here in Mackerfelt Library.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jillian. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So Sheena, I've been having a wee look at your website and to get some background on you, obviously. And I see that you're the winner of multiple Children's Books Ireland Awards. Which books were those for?
Actually, most of my books have won awards or been shortlisted for them. I think there's only maybe 2 that haven't.
Brilliant.
So, I've won quite a few Children's Books Ireland Awards and been shortlisted for the Irish Book Awards and various other awards. So that's, well, it's always nice. You know, obviously there's plenty of times I haven't won awards, but my first book won a lot of awards, both at home and internationally, and then my second book won the Children's Books Ireland Book of the Year Award, which is the biggest children's book award in Ireland. So that gave my career a really good kind of kickstart, just, at a really important time. So I've always been very, very happy about that.
Yeah. And was that the time then you went into full-time writing after that? You were teaching before that?
That's right, yes. People used to say to me, once I'd had a few books published, oh, you'll be leaving the day job. And I knew how little money those books actually brought in, despite the good reviews, despite the awards. So I used to laugh and say, well, that will never happen. And then in 2012, I got a major award from the Arts Council, which allowed me initially to take a 1-year career break. But then I found that, like most writers, there are all sorts of ways to make a living as a writer, which aren't the actual writing of the books. But for example, I teach a lot of workshops, I do a lot of writing development, I do manuscript critiques, I mentor people, all kinds of things, school visits, that sort of thing. And I realised that I was well able to make a living. And so I've been a freelance writer now for over 10 years.
Brilliant. And I see you've got 8 children's books.
Yep, 9th one is being published this autumn, and then 1 adult novel. So this will be my 10th book, will be published this year. So it's 10 books and quite a few short stories and things in, I think, about 14 years.
Very good. You're pretty prolific, aren't you?
I do work hard. I think because my first few books were written while I was teaching full-time, I had a horse to look after, I was commuting from Castlewellan, where I used to live, to Belfast. I think I was so poor in time that I just became very, very disciplined and just really, really used the time that I had free to write. Now that I don't have a day job, you would think that I would have more time, but actually the workshops and the admin and all that kind of thing also takes up quite a lot of time. So yes, I have become pretty disciplined at just turning up at the desk and writing.
That brings me on to something else I was interested in. Horses and ponies seem to feature a lot in your children's books. Yeah, at the beginning anyway.
At the beginning, yeah. I always write about things that I'm really interested in and obviously that I know about. And for the first 3 books of my career, I had a horse called Scarlet, a Welsh pony. And I'd been a kind of a pony mad child, and I never owned a pony until I was an adult. But I suppose when I first started writing, I don't necessarily believe, you have to write what you know, because my most recent novels have all been historical. But I suppose I was spending hours every day with my pony, and it was a natural thing to write about. So yeah, the first 3 books were all featured horses. But I haven't written about horses for quite a while now, although I try and sneak a horse, even if it's just kind of trotting past. I try and sneak a horse into everything, which is not that difficult because ever since 2015 most of my books have been historical, so it's quite easy to, horse and cart can be clip-clopping down the road quite easily. Yes,
well, you mentioned there you started off writing about horses, but what age were you when you started writing? Have you always had an interest?
I'm probably quite a cliched writer in the sense that I was a child who was obsessed with books. I loved stories. I loved reading from a very, very early age. And really, as soon as I could write, I was writing my own little stories. My granda used to give me scrap paper, and I used to sew. I don't know why he didn't also give me a stapler, but anyway, I used to sew the edges of these together and make tiny little notebooks. And obviously with my kind of 6-year-old handwriting, I could probably only manage to get maybe a few words on each page, but those were my earliest stories, and sadly I don't have any of them. But I do have some books of stories that I wrote when I was 8, 9, 10 and throughout my teens.
Yeah, very interesting, yeah. And I think there's a lot of writers would say that, and I suppose another thing that I was going to ask you about is, did libraries feature in your childhood?
Jillian, I'm not just saying this because you're a librarian, but I genuinely feel that the library was the most important place in my life as a child. And that's not an exaggeration. I grew up in the 70s in Belfast, and coming from a mixed background, I always felt, I suppose, a sense of not belonging, a sense of having an identity which didn't seem to be quite legitimate, and also, without wanting to over-dramatise things, quite a strong sense of anxiety and fear. And certainly my mother feared for me because I lived in a very loyalist estate. Mummy and all her family were Catholics, and that was the kind of information that she felt was better kept to ourselves, and that was just the reality of Belfast in the 70s. I was a very mouthy child, so I don't think she could have trusted me not to go into the street and say, my ma's a Catholic, don't you dare slag Catholics off. So maybe possibly because of that, and possibly because I had always shown an interest in stories, I was very much encouraged to go to the library. So my local library was the Craiga Library, which at that time in the mid-70s was brand new. It was up at the top of the Craig Road, it still is. And it was my haven, because as soon as you opened that door and went in among the books, you weren't in Belfast anymore. You weren't in 1975 or 1976 or 1977 anymore. You could be wherever you wanted to be. And for me, that was, just everywhere. I could be, roaming through the prairies with Laura and Mary. I could be having fun in the chalet school in the Alps. I could be at Mallory Towers. I could be solving mysteries with the Five Found Outers or having adventures with the famous Five. So that whole world of story was a world that just welcomed me in a way that perhaps my immediate environment didn't. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have a lot of money. So although I did have books of my own, my grandparents would have bought me books, I was a fast reader, and really only the library could keep up with that. So I tell this a lot on school visits, but it's absolutely true that if it hadn't been for the library, I couldn't have been the reader that I was. And if I hadn't been the reader that I was, I wouldn't have become a writer. So that world of stories just welcomed me so much that quite quickly it wasn't enough just to consume the stories. I wanted to make them. So that's what I did, and that's what I'm still doing.
And was it an automatic thing then for you to write children's stories rather than adults? Was that a specific choice?
No, it wasn't really a specific choice. I'd always just thought of myself, I suppose I really thought of myself as writing for adults. And then when I was writing Taking Flight, which was my first published novel, the story happened to be a story about a boy and a horse, and he was 15, 16. And what you find is once you've written in one particular genre, or something is marketed in a particular way, readers and publishers like you to keep on doing the same thing. So I was very happy writing for teenagers and writing for children. I still am. I love that kind of intensity of writing about people finding out who they are and experiencing things, love, hate, jealousy, maybe for the first time. But I did always want to write for kind of all age groups. So my most recent book, Mrs. Hart's Marriage Bureau, which came out last year, is for adults. All of my other books have been for older children or teenagers, but a lot of my fans would be adults. And I always try and write, to be honest, I don't really think so much about the audience. I think very much about the character, and once I have got inside the character's head and I've got the character's voice, then whether that's a book for 10-year-olds, like my middle grade novel Too Many Ponies, or the novel that I'm actually editing at the moment, which is coming out in autumn, for 10-year-olds, or whether it's for teenagers like Taking Flight or Grounded or Street Song, that doesn't really seem to matter so much as inhabiting the character. Once I've inhabited the character, then the book seems to come out with the right kind of sensibility for the age group that it's for.
Yeah. So I was doing a wee bit of research, as I said, and I came across a book
good librarian.
Came across a book called Friends in the Fourth, which
that is a blast from the past, Jillian. Well done on your research.
And I thought, oh right, okay, so this must be about boarding school.
Yes.
And then I realised it's actually your thesis that you did for your PhD.
Yes.
And you've obviously made it into the book, and of course it covers the Chalet School, which was one of my favourites a long time ago, and Mallory Towers. You didn't mention St Clair's that much, I don't think, because St Clair's was I think it was Mallory Towers seemed to be the one that was mentioned more.
I always felt Mallory Towers was better than St Clair's,
Did
although
you?
I did enjoy St Clair's as well.
Well, I loved them all anyway, the tinned peaches and the sardines.
Oh yes,
and the night feasts.
Me too.
Anyway. Did you go to boarding school, or what's the
Not
interest
at all.
with it?
No, not at all. And I don't think many people who grew up in the Craig still went to boarding school. I think, like a lot of children, I read what was available, that for a start, and in the 70s, a lot of what was available were books from the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
But also I read to escape, and I loved the idea of, I loved the idea of having a pony, but I also loved the idea of going to boarding school. And I never did, obviously. Perhaps if I had actually gone to boarding school, I wouldn't have been so interested in it. But I've always been interested in kind of female spaces and places where women, and particularly I suppose young women, had autonomy. And I think even in the 70s, I was probably aware of, I probably hadn't heard the word feminist, but I was certainly aware that there were inequalities at play in the world that I lived in. And so maybe at some level, reading something like Mallory Towers or the Chalet School, where it wasn't, you weren't being told, as you were in the Famous Five, oh, girls can't do that.
Yes.
Because in those books, everybody was a girl, and girls could do everything, and girls could be anything. So there were girls who were tomboys, there were girls who were very clever, there were girls who were naughty, there were girls who were very caring. It seemed to be a world where you could discover who you were without really any limitations. Yeah. So I think that was maybe the fascination. And so when I studied English at Durham University, and then I went on and did a PhD, and writing about those female spaces was sort of the natural thing to do. And what was quite unusual about my thesis was the fact that I wrote about adult fiction and children's fiction within the same thesis, which maybe now wouldn't be considered strange, but certainly in the early 90s when I was writing it, it raised a few eyebrows. But then I think it was in the sort of mid-2000s, I ran into a small publisher at a conference, and I was doing a paper on Antonia Forrest, and she was very interested in it, and she was interested in the thesis, and offered to publish it. So yes, it's officially my first book, Friends and the Fourth, published by a very small Bethany Press, but very, very. I only possess one copy of it. So this copy that I'm looking at here from the library is. I see that it has been borrowed once.
No, that's a false thing because it's all done automatically. We don't stamp them anymore. We haven't stamped books for a long time.
That's right, sure, I should know that. Yes. I still go to the library regularly.
Nothing stamped anymore. So yes, I wanted to move on to your historical novels.
That's my real love.
Yes, I presume you spend a lot of time doing research for those, and do you have to go to Dublin? Are they based in the north or the south?
They're all based in the north.
They're
all, well, Mrs. Hart's Marriage Bureau is set in Yorkshire, but the main character is from mid-Ulster. But no, my historical trilogy, Name Upon Name, Star by Star, and Hope Against Hope are all set in what became Northern Ireland in 1921. So in Hope Against Hope, it's Northern Ireland. Before that, it's just the north, and obviously that was before partition. Yes, it was very, very important to me to write about the experience in the north, and it was also very important to me. Name Upon Name was my first historical novel, and I was commissioned by my publisher Little Island to write something to commemorate the Easter Rising, and initially they had hesitated about asking me because I was from the north, and obviously the Easter Rising is associated with Dublin, but its effects of course were felt all over the island, and that includes the north. So not only did I write from the perspective of a young woman from the north, but I also thought about how I had felt growing up with my mixed background and feeling that I wasn't part of anything, that my identity somehow was lesser than, or, that I just wasn't really included. And when I would look back at history, I think it's more nuanced now, but it was very much about the orange and the green, and there seemed to be nothing in between, and I knew that there was an awful lot in between, including my own experience. So my heroine, Helen, in Name Upon Name, is a young woman with a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, And if that was complicated for me in the 1970s, it was even more complicated for her in 1916, where she had one cousin off fighting in the British Army, and another cousin whose background was very nationalist, but who also, like tens of thousands of other young men from nationalist backgrounds, wanted to go and fight, and in fact did go and fight for the British Army. So there was so much conflict there. I mean, it was a joy to write, actually, because it was very easy to write a story which took the events of Easter in Dublin and showed the ramifications in a family kind of 100 miles up the road.
Yeah. Did you have any backlash from the books whenever you published them? Was there any?
I had a lot of praise for the even-handed way in which I wrote about cultural identity and politics. And that meant a lot to me, because I thought, well, if I can't have a balanced view of things, then
who can?
Who can? So actually, with all my historical novels, they've all attracted praise for the accessible way they write about history, but also that very kind of even-handed way, and that's always been really, really important to me. I could never. I mean, also, these books are stories, so they're not polemical. They're not, they're not didactic. Obviously, I would hope that people might learn something as they go, and certainly in my novel Star by Star, which was written to commemorate the centenary of women voting. If people read that book and come away from it more determined to vote and make their vote count, well, I'll be very happy about that.
Yeah. So moving on then, you mentioned Mrs. Hart's
Marriage Bureau.
Yes. Mrs. Hart's Marriage Bureau, yeah. And which I thoroughly enjoyed, actually.
Good.
And you very kindly came along to our book group and talked to us. And so we were, at the time you mentioned the possibility of a sequel. Has anything ever come of that, or you've been too busy doing the other?
Well, as things stand at the moment, Mrs. Hart's Marriage Bureau was published last year by HarperCollins Ireland, and the paperback, the small paperback, the mass market paperback as we call it, is coming out this March from HarperCollins in London, with a brand new cover, and it will also be a lot cheaper than the big paperback, so that would be a really good time to go out and buy it. Everyone who has read the novel, I think almost without exception, has asked me, is there going to be a sequel? There has to be a sequel.
Yeah.
And when I first got the contract from HarperCollins, they also mentioned that, would I be interested in writing a sequel? And I said I would. So as things stand, I had a one-book deal from HarperCollins, so I don't have a contract for the sequel, but I have written it.
Ooh.
And it exists.
Brilliant.
And hopefully it will see the light of day. When I say it exists, a very, very rough first draft exists, but I'm going away in a couple of weeks' time to turn that very rough first draft into a much, much better second draft, which hopefully I can show to my agent and show to a few of my trusted writer friends and get some feedback.
You mentioned another book that you're editing at the moment. Is this
Yes.
a children's book?
This fits in so nicely with what you're asking me about the school stories. So when Mrs. Hart's Marriage Bureau came out last March, I did quite a lot of press interviews and things, and one was for the Irish Times. And I was asked by someone who, like you, had done the research very well, you've got a PhD in girls' school stories, but you've never written one. Would you like to write one? And I made a comment that was half flippant and half slightly throwing the idea out into the universe. And I said, well, I've never written a girls' school story, but if there's any publisher out there who'd like to commission one, come and talk to me. And about 3 weeks later, I got an email from O'Brien Press in Dublin, who I never worked with before, and they said, we were very interested in your comment in the Irish Times. We would love to publish a girls' school story by you. Would you be interested in talking to us? And for about 3 minutes, Jillian, I thought, what am I going to do? Because really, I want to write for adults now. And then very, very quickly, I thought, Sheena, don't be daft. You love girls' school stories. You would love the chance to write a girls' school story. And O'Brien are a really good publisher, so at least think about it. And by the end of the day, I think I had more or less my plot worked out. So it's coming out in the autumn. It hasn't been announced officially yet, but I'm sure it's fine to tell you that. It's set in a fictional day and boarding school in South Belfast, just sort of on the banks of the Lagan, because I thought that was a good place for girls to get up to no good.
Plenty of dips in the water, I'm sure.
There haven't been any dips in the water in this book, but hopefully there will be a series, and somebody might well end up getting wet. Maybe they might jump in to rescue a dog or something like that, because that's the kind of girls they are. It's called First Term at Fernside, and it's coming out in the autumn.
Brilliant.
And it's set in 1925.
Right.
And actually it was a lot of fun to write something which was historical, but which didn't have to be about politics, religion, cultural identity, partition, elections, soldiers, anything like that.
Something completely different then.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. The last thing I wanted to ask you about was, in your website I noticed you said about writing a memoir, which I would imagine is very different from writing fiction, and it would make you very vulnerable possibly, and you'd have to be careful about what you mention and who you mention.
Yes, it's very
Where's
difficult.
that coming on?
It's funny because my agent was asking me this yesterday. I had, I suppose, maybe a slightly unconventional path through life, in that I was really very happily single, living alone for really all of my adult life. I hadn't even had boyfriends since I was about 30. And I was very happy with that way, and felt that was just the status quo. And then, just coming up to 5 years ago, I fell madly in love with someone I had known for 30 years, about a year after his wife had died. So that was a situation which threw my whole life into turmoil of a very nice kind, but suddenly, and by the way, he fell in love with me too. So that's an important part of the story. So after having had this life, which was very much about being a woman on my own, forging, my own kind of path, being very independent, and not being lonely, but having to work quite hard to make sure that I wasn't lonely. Suddenly I was a wife, a stepmother, and living in a different part of the country, because there was a child involved who couldn't be uprooted, and it made me reassess a lot of things in my life, and I suppose it threw a lot of things into relief. And also at that time that I was kind of planning a wedding and everything, I was also going through the menopause. So everything it all felt like it was quite highly charged, and that there was maybe something that other women might be interested in. Because certainly the time that I was just getting involved with The Widower, I would have loved something to read about that experience. But apart from some kind of cautionary tales, there really didn't seem to be anything. So I started off writing a bit about that experience. Initially, I thought I would write a book, but the way the book has come to me, or the way the stories have come to me, have been very much as quite self-contained personal essays. So what I have done really with them is I have used them to enter memoir competitions. So one piece came second in the Fish Memoir competition 2 years ago, and then one piece won a new award called the Plaza Prize last year. So I've only had a couple of short pieces published, but they've certainly brought in as much money as some of my novels have. So that's kind of how things are going with the memoir. But you're absolutely right, it is very different, and I find it much harder than writing fiction. At the time that I was writing it also, I had finished Mrs. Hart's Marriage Bureau. It was on submission, and I didn't really know what I wanted to write next, so I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if this adult book would find a publisher or anything, and life was very hectic as well. It was also COVID. I mean, there was just so much going on. So short memoir just seemed the right thing for me to be writing at the time. But now, after Mrs. Hart was published and I started writing the sequel, and then I wrote First Term at Fernside, I don't really have time for the memoir at the moment, but there's a body of work there, and I will keep sending it out.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think we've covered most of your life, Sheena. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you,
Gillian.
Jillian.
We look forward to
it's been a
whatever
real pleasure.
comes next for you.
Thank you.